Tara here. We've got The Bridge to Belle Island, Chapter 17. So, Evan Curtis, he was a little sus, as we say. Suspicious, don't be suspicious, don't be suspicious. Alright, Chapter 17. Time to get serious. In the morning, Benjamin ate a solitary breakfast, then took his coffee and a newspaper out to the veranda. He guessed Miss Wilder had already left for the weaving shed. It was a cool, breezy morning, and he hoped the fresh air would help him think and keep a clear head. But instead of any revelations, he simply sat on the outdoor sofa and soaked in the peace of a new day, listening to bird song and watching the boats passing by on the river. Occasionally, one of the crew raised a hand in greeting as they passed, and Benjamin returned it as though he lived there, his hand remarkably steady. "Thank you," he murmured to his Creator, "and help me." Miss Lawrence came out of the house, wool shawl wrapped around herself and teacup in hand. "May I join you?" "Of course." He was surprised she would want to talk to him after their confrontation outside the cellar door. As if reading his thoughts, Rose said, "I am sorry I was cross with you. I know you are trying to help, but it sometimes does not feel that way." "I understand. I am sorry too." She sat on the opposite end of the cushion, pulling her feet under her to keep them warm under skirt and shawl. "Bit chilly this morning, but so beautiful." She inhaled deeply, surveying the scene much as he had done. "I love it here. I miss it when I'm away." "Yet you live in London most of the time." He quickly raised a palm. "I am not criticizing, I assure you. After all, I live there too." "Then you know London has its own kind of beauty, with its squares and parks, museums and magnificent buildings."
"And its shops and theaters and society."
She sent him a dimpled grin. "Those too, now that you mention it."
"What was it like, growing up here?"
Good question. In most ways idyllic. Of course, at first I was scared and sad and missing my parents. Thankfully, I didn't lose O'Toole as well, or I really would have been terrified. I was 6, almost 7 when I arrived here. Being relatively young, the pain faded quickly, and Aunt Belle was everything loving and affectionate. Well, you see how kind she is. So I had a happy childhood despite my losses. The Miss Farringdons came often to see me. You met them at the party. And there was another girl in the village, the schoolmaster's daughter, who would come over to play. Aunt Belle preferred my friends to come to the island, of course, but she didn't forbid me to cross the bridge, though naturally both she and O'Toole warned me to avoid the river. My aunt knew her fears were not completely rational, and she didn't want me to be so encumbered, but for the most part I willingly stayed on the island. It was a heavenly playground for a girl. At one point I even had my own pet duck. It followed me everywhere."
He chuckled, imagining the scene.
But when I was 15 or so, I began longing to experience more of the world, wanting a bit of freedom and diversion and social life.
"And admirers?" Ben added helpfully.
"Exactly." Another dimpled grin appeared. "Later, an old friend of my grandmother's, Lady Elliot, you met her too, agreed to host me in London for a season. She had a house in town near ours. Aunt Belle had spent several seasons in London herself as a young woman, so how could she forbid me? Of course, we both thought I would come back after the season, but then I met Mr. Adair, and that was that." She sighed dreamily.
"How does your aunt feel about your staying in town?"
"She doesn't like it. And in truth, I missed her too. Lady Elliot was polite and generous, but she had her own life to live. So eventually Uncle Percy moved into the townhouse as my guardian and set up an office there."
"And how did you feel about that?"
She wrinkled her nose. "I wished Aunt Belle could live with me instead. If she could have at least visited me from time to time, it would have been perfect. But she could not."
Could not or would not? Rose looked at him, expression earnest. I understand your question, Mr. Booker, but my aunt is not pretending to be unable to leave. She honestly feels she can't, and as far as I know, she hasn't. Not in many years. She leaned a bit closer. I can see in your eyes that you want to believe me, that you want to believe her. You admire her, I think. It was her turn to hold up a hand. Don't answer. But if you do admire her, you are a very wise man. The young woman unfolded herself and stood. Now, please excuse me. I promised to sort through my mother's jewelry this morning and pick some things to take back with me. I shall leave you to think it over. Benjamin rose as well. He thought of following her, of refuting her claim, but the echoing thud of footfalls crossing the bridge caught his ear. He turned and saw a man wearing a dark coat step from the bridge and cross the lawn. A familiar man. Anxiety needled his stomach. Officer Riley, is it not? That's right. The Bow Street runner ascended the veranda steps. Benjamin kept his tone light. What are you doing here? You're a bit far from home. I could say the same of you, sir. Yes, well, the Wilder family are long-time clients of our firm. Including the pretty Miss Watt Lawrence you were chatting with all familiar like. Ben stiffened. It was merely friendly conversation. Uh-huh. He did not appear convinced. The officer looked around him. Never been out this far. Beautiful country. So you've come to admire the views? Benjamin said dryly. I thought you were pursuing the missing silver in London. He nodded. I did. Traced him down to a pawn seller not far from the Wilder townhouse. I was hoping he could tell me the silver had been brought in by some notorious thief, but alas, no. Brought in by someone who actually works for the family. My first thought was Mary Williams, since she'd disappeared, but as I'm standing there in the pawn shop, who should come in but the manservant Marvin. He ambled in, as proud as you please, with a silver candlestick. When he saw me, he looked startled indeed, but held his ground. Insisted the master himself had told him to see what he could get for the silver pitcher and candelabras. You didn't believe him? Not at first, but I took him with me to talk to the housekeeper again, and she admitted she overheard Mr. Norris say, I don't care what you have to sell, just get the money to pay the man. Apparently the stipend he received as trustee did not stretch far enough. Still, I said to Marvin, and today you expect me to believe Mr. Norris told you to sell that candlestick from the grave? At that, old Marvin finally looked guilty, but he lifted his whiskered chin and said, No, sir, but no one is paying my wages now he's gone. I only took what I had coming to me. Mrs. Kittleson confirmed that no money is coming in for wages or household expenses. Would have thought you lawyers would have seen to that, representing the Wilder family all these years and all. Benjamin was surprised as well. The officer continued. Mrs. Kittleson had already told me about the housemaid leaving her employ without so much as a by your leave. I searched for her, but... Benjamin interrupted him. Yes, Mr. Hardy told me about her disappearance, and her death. Officer Riley nodded. I stopped by the hallowed offices of Norris, Hardy, and Hunt, but only Mr. Hunt was in, and he pleaded ignorance of the whole affair, though he did tell me where I could find you and Mr. Hardy. Yes, well, thank you for coming all this way to let the family know. I am sure Miss Wilder will make amends to the London servants as soon as possible. Oh, but that's not the reason I'm here. Now that I've run the absconding housemaid and theft gone wrong theories to the ground, I am here to pursue other suspects among the family. That is what I have been doing. Oh? Officer Riley's expression conveyed disbelief, his tone sarcasm. And have you any evidence for me? Benjamin considered mentioning the garnet earring, but when he hesitated, the officer continued. You looked awfully cozy when I arrived. Made yourself quite at home here. Probably present the family with a lengthy bill for the privilege of hosting you, too, as snipes do. Lawyers were said to resemble those birds due to their long bills. Benjamin gritted his teeth at the officer's mocking. Yet could he blame the man? What a picture he must have made, lounging on the veranda, talking and laughing with Miss Lawrence as if they were old friends. The man's eyes twinkled. Well, excuse me if I don't rush back to Bow Street and tell my superiors that the infamous Benish Booker has the matter in hand. Lulling the wilder ladies into a false sense of security, are you? Just waiting for the right time to spring a trap? Benjamin inwardly seethed, yet shame held his tongue. He was the one who'd been lulled into a false sense of security. No, sir. Officer Riley hitched up his trousers and squared his shoulders, adding an inch to his small frame. I've come to take in Miss Wilder for questioning. Shock jolted Benjamin. Take in Isabel? Off the island? A slew of dread and protectiveness washed over him at the thought. Riley slowly shook his head, eyes alight with humor. Fell for another conniving female, did you? Benjamin fisted his hands. Why Miss Wilder and not Miss Lawrence or Mr. Adair? Based on what evidence? Did the housekeeper identify that earring we found as belonging to her? Riley shook his head. Didn't recognize it. Assumes it must belong to Miss Lawrence. Benjamin hesitated, gallantry wrestling with conscience. He asked God for wisdom, but heard no clear answer. If Riley had brought that earring with him, he would feel duty-bound to hand over the matching one. Benjamin pressed dry lips together. Do you still have the earring? Riley shrugged. Gave it to the housekeeper. Nothing useful there. I haven't ruled out the pretty young miss yet as far as the poisoning is concerned, but as for the bludgeoning, she and Adair have alibis. Has Miss Wilder? I believe so, Benjamin faltered. Had she? Was falling asleep in the boathouse sufficient alibi? Not likely, especially as she would be reluctant to admit a man had been with her most of the night. The officer smirked. Well, let's go and ask her, shall we? Benjamin led Officer Riley into the house. He saw Mr. Hardy coming up from the kitchen, a biscuit in hand. Just talking to Mrs. Philpotts. Excellent woman. Then he noticed the Bow Street runner behind Ben. Ah, Officer Riley, we were expecting you. He joined them as they walked to the study. Benjamin hoped he might have time to come up with a plan before the officer confronted Miss Wilder, but upon entering, he saw that she had already returned from the weaving shed, apparently through the garden door. She sat at the desk, a few bills of lading before her. Mr. Hardy made the introductions, while Benjamin stood stiffly mute, feeling like a failure and a betrayer. He was aware of her wary glances in his direction, looking for reassurance. Reassurance he could not give. Hardy explained, Officer Riley is with the Bow Street office in London. He has been assigned to investigate Percival's death. Oh. Another glance at Benjamin. Then she entwined her long fingers on the desk and faced the officer. I thought you were pursuing suspects in London. I was indeed, Officer Riley replied. I have now turned my attention elsewhere. Benjamin quickly summarized the situation with Marvin and the pawn seller and the servants' lack of wages. Oh no, Miss Wilder exclaimed. With everything going on here, it did not cross my mind that poor Mrs. Kittleson was having to struggle on with no income. Thank you for coming to alert me to the situation, Mr. Riley. The officer looked to Benjamin, as if waiting for him to explain his real purpose. Was Riley suddenly hesitant in Isabel's presence, surprised by her genteel nature and attractiveness as he had been, or did he simply enjoy watching Benjamin squirm? He swallowed. That is not the only reason Officer Riley has come. No? She turned to the weasel-like man, brows high in expectation. Riley cleared his throat. I am here to ascertain, that is, to inquire as to your whereabouts on the night of Percival Norris's death. I was here, Mr. Riley, on the island. As anyone can tell you, I never leave it. Is that so? It is. And why is that? Sorry, my Cockney accent's not very good. Because I cannot. You will think me very strange, but I have lost nearly my entire family when they ventured from home. At your hand? What? No! That is not what I meant at all. My brother and sister died hundreds of miles from here, he somewhere at sea and she en route from India. My parents died in a carriage accident driving to the London docks to meet her ship. I can hardly be blamed for any of those deaths, but the fear of meeting with a similar fate has taken hold, and the very thought of leaving brings on a disabling fit of panic. Very convenient. Not at all, actually. Quite the opposite. I should have dearly loved to attend my niece's engagement dinner in London, and long to be there for her upcoming wedding, but I fear it will prove impossible. And am I to take your word for it? The man's reticence faded as he continued to question her. You may ask anyone you like. The servants, my friends, villagers. I will do. But even if I find no one willing to speak out against the local squiress, I believe you were in London that night. In fact, I have evidence to prove it. Miss Wilder shot Benjamin a look. He felt the earring pricking a hole in his pocket. She must think he'd handed it over. He subtly shook his head, hoping she'd understand his meaning. She looked back at the officer. What evidence? Riley pulled something from his pocket. Not an earring, but paper. He unfolded it and held the letter before her face. She reached for it, but he shook his head. She leaned nearer and squinted at the page, growing pale as she read. Then the officer shifted the letter toward Benjamin and to Mr. Hardy. Ben bent and read the scrawled message. I seen Miss Wilder in London the night P. Norris died. Beside him, Hardy gave a low whistle. From where was it posted? Lombard Street Post Office, London. No signature? Ben scowled. You're going to believe an anonymous, barely legible note like that? Benjamin? Hardy's low voice reminded him to stay calm. Riley stiffened. I am not on trial here, Mr. Booker. Miss Wilder is. She is not on trial either. Not yet. Miss Officer Riley turned back to Isabel. How do you explain this, Miss Wilder? I don't know. How strange. Do you think someone wants me to take the blame for his death for some reason? Or perhaps you deserve the blame for some reason? I don't. Even if I were in London, that is not a crime. It would not mean I killed anyone. If you would lie about the one, why not the other? I didn't lie. I'm just saying I did not kill Uncle Percy. We know you were angry with him, argued with him. I did, yes. I don't deny it. I may have threatened him with words, but that is all I did. I have a wine bottle marked with a Belle Island label that says otherwise. Wine very likely responsible for poisoning not one, but two persons. Perhaps your niece took the bottle into his office, but then you went to town to make sure he died. I would never do such a thing. I swear it. You may very well have your chance to swear in court. I would like you to come with me to London, Miss Wilder. See if any of the neighbors remember seeing you near the house that the day Norris was bludgeoned. Find us a real live witness to go along with this letter. What? No! She grabbed hold of her father's desk as though it were an anchor. The officer took her elbow and pulled her away, escorting her out of the study. As they crossed the hall, she looked back over her shoulder at Benjamin following behind, his mind whirling to think of some way out of this. Drawn by the hubbub, Rose and Adair came out of the morning room, and Rose's eyes widened. "Aunt Belle?" She looked at Benjamin in alarm. "Mr. Booker, what is going on?" Riley opened the front door and dragged his captive through it. Isabel cried out. She grabbed hold of one of the columns flanking the door and sank to the ground. She looked and sounded like a terrified, wounded child. It propelled Benjamin to step forward between the officer and woman, and only after doing so did he think of what to say. "Have you an official warrant or summons? Is Miss Wilder under indictment by a master? Is Miss Wilder under indictment by a magistrate?" "Well, not exactly. I haven't found witnesses yet, but I shall." "Then as her lawyer, I must insist that you wait until you have a warrant or duly authorized summons." Mr. Hardy spoke up. "Officer Riley will at least want to search the wine cellar while he's here to look for evidence of poison." Benjamin reiterated, "If he has the appropriate warrant." Riley fluttered the letter. "I have just cause, and if the magistrate sees it as you do, then he will no doubt send you back with the proper paperwork. If so, we shan't hinder you further." He glanced at Hardy, but it seemed Benjamin was the only one fighting this. "Come now, be reasonable," Riley said. "He shall not look kindly on my returning empty-handed, only to be asked to be sent back again with a piece of paper." Benjamin set his jaw. "Miss Wilder is a woman of influence in this county. If you besmirch her reputation on such flimsy evidence, I will make sure your superiors hear of it, and what a row her well-connected friends shall raise." Rose chimed in. "And her family." "I doubt you shall keep your position when I'm through with you," Ben insisted. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You're not serious? That's all bluster." "Are you certain? Do you want to take that risk? Especially when the court will pay for the miles you travel in pursuit of your duties? An additional shilling a mile, is it? You can't mind that, I'm sure." The man hesitated. He was in a vulnerable position, and he knew it. The officer held Benjamin's gaze a moment longer, then said, "Very well, I won't mind the extra pay, you're right. But I shall return. Can I trust Miss Wilder will not to run off before I get back?" He surveyed the crumpled figure huddled around the column. His lips quirked as he dryly answered his own question. "Yes, I think it a safe assumption." After the officer left, Benjamin helped Miss Wilder to her feet. She avoided his gaze. He longed to soothe her embarrassment and distress, but resisted, conscious of the senior partner beside him. Thankfully, Rose embraced her aunt and led her back inside. For a few minutes the two lawyers remained where they were. Noticing Mr. Hardy's watchful gaze on his profile, Ben said, "You think I'm doing it again, don't you? Defending another woman who is not as innocent as she appears." "It sure looks that way, though I hope I'm wrong for your sake." Mr. Hardy sighed, then said, "Even so, I admire what you did there, standing up to that runner." Benjamin looked at the older man in surprise. "Thank you, sir." "I just hope you haven't antagonized him to the point that he's more determined than ever to gather evidence against your Miss Wilder, perhaps partly to spite you." What a dreadful prediction. Benjamin hoped he was wrong. You got a perspective change. Isabel and Mr. Booker sat on the veranda together later that morning. The sunshine and birdsong were peaceful and relaxing after her panic-filled ordeal. Isabel felt wrung out, every muscle weary, yet she also felt an exhilarating ripple of something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. She glanced over at Mr. Booker, casual posture, one ankle crossed over his knee, gazing out at the water. She thought of how he had looked rowing on the river, broad shoulders taut, pulling with skill and strength, the boat gliding effortlessly through the water, his wavy dark hair tousled by the wind. It had warmed her heart to see Joe in the boat with him, the two talking and laughing as they went off fishing together. Now she said softly, "Thank you again for intervening." Benjamin turned his head. "I am sorry I didn't react more quickly." "You rescued me, and that is what counts." His gentle gaze lingered on her face. "Have you tried to leave? To cross the bridge yourself?" "Yes, unsuccessfully." "When did you first realize you were unable to do so?" "It was, a few months after the funeral. Rose and I were going to the churchyard to lay flowers on my parents' grave, but I had to turn back." He sat forward, elbows resting on his knees. "What does it feel like? Can you describe it?" Isabel reflected. She laid a hand on her abdomen, then drew two fingers forth as though pulling a thread. "It is a nervous, panicky feeling in my stomach trying to hold me back as I walk toward the bridge. It's as if the house has me on a leash, and I can only go so far before it catches me up. I feel the tugging first, then the cord tightens and binds around my chest until I can hardly breathe." She drew in a shaky inhale before continuing. "The closer I get to the bridge, the longer its span appears to be, until the space between Belle Island and Riverton seems a wide, treacherous chasm. My heart beats like a crazed bird trying to break free from my chest. I have to fight with every ounce of my being, the alarm clanging in my brain, screaming at me to run back into the house. If I don't retreat, I become nauseous and dizzy. I perspire and shake. I can't move, can't see properly. I feel as though I must be dying, because that is the only explanation I can think of for feeling so ghastly." She steeled herself and glanced over, expecting to see shock or revulsion. But she saw only warm sympathy and perhaps empathy. He whispered, "I'm sorry." She straightened and said lightly, "Well, now that I've told you all that, you no doubt think me a lunatic, and I can't blame you." "No, I don't. I experienced something similar with my vertigo, though to a lesser extent." "Poor Mr. Booker," Isabel murmured sincerely. "I wouldn't wish that on anyone." He humbly dipped his head. "I live in fear of having an episode in public. In fact, the very thought of it can bring on the symptoms." "Then don't think about it," Isabel said with a teasing wink, "and stay off the roof." He gave her a self-deprecating grin. "Oh, I think it's safe to say you will never see me up there." Foreshadowing. A short while later, Mr. Booker returned to the study, but Isabel lingered on the veranda, remembering that day she first realized she could not cross the bridge. She had missed church the previous few weeks, due to inclement weather, and then because she had come down with a bothersome cold. By the following week, however, she felt better and decided to venture forth despite the typically damp, gray English weather. She gathered flowers from the border of the kitchen garden and handed Rose a pair of daisies. She wanted the little girl to grow up knowing her grandparents, even in this small way, to know how much they had cared for and prayed for her, even though they had never met. Isabel also wanted the child to remember her own parents, of course. But Rose's father had died in India, and Grace at sea. Isabel still cringed at the thought of her dear sister's body being wrapped in canvas and tipped overboard, committed to the deep and left to sink with the fishes. She wished she'd had a chance to claim Grace's body and give her a proper burial. Rose had skipped ahead, but tripped and fell on the grass. Isabel followed, concern hastening her step. "Are you all right?" The little girl sat up, tears running down her dirt-smeared face. "Owie!" "Let me see." Isabel crouched beside her. Observing the fallen stocking and scraped little knee, a bud of maternal tenderness blossomed in her breast. "I imagine that stings, my love, but you are all right. When we get back, I shall wash it up and put some lavender salve on it. Remember, we made some in the still room?" Rose nodded, tears ceasing. Shall we go and lay our flowers first? The little girl vigorously nodded, blonde curls bouncing. And may we buy licorice from the shop? I believe you have already eaten all the licorice in Riverton, but we can ask. When will Mr. Evan come back? He always gives me candy. Not for a long time, I'm afraid, if ever. The thought came unbidden. It was a dangerous world out there at any time, and with a war on? Isabel shivered. Rose picked up the fallen flowers, which looked a little worse for their accident, and clambered to her feet. Accident. The word echoed in her mind. Taking her niece firmly by the hand, her own bouquet in the other, they walked on toward the bridge. But something was wrong. Each step seemed more arduous than the last. Unease hung heavy on her, like a weighted cloak. A distasteful, itchy sense of having neglected some important task, or of an impending and dreaded obligation. What was happening? Her niece's injury was minor indeed, so that was no cause for concern. Even so, sweat dampened Isabel's forehead and prickled her underarms. As a dutiful daughter, she ought to be eager to go and put flowers on her parents' grave. Yet fear and guilt, like a ball of toffee boiled rock hard, filled her stomach. Reaching the bridge, Isabel stopped as though at a glass wall. Her nerves tingled messages of danger, alarm, and her mother's final, anxious words ricocheted through her brain. Stay home, stay safe. Rose looked up at her, confusion puckering her little brow. Are we not going to the churchyard? Isabel swallowed and forced a cheerful tone. The morning is damp, my dear. I fear it shall rain any moment. Let us return to the house and take care of your knee. We shall go another day instead. But that day never came. After a few minutes, Isabel rose and walked gingerly to the rear of the house. She still didn't feel quite the thing since her encounter with Officer Riley, but she wanted to retrieve Ollie from where she'd tethered him beneath a shade tree, contentedly gnawing a bone from the kitchen. Rounding the house, she saw Evan Curtis and Carlotta speaking to one another in the garden, their voices weaving together in pleasant harmony. The words, however, were indecipherable. As Isabel neared, she realized they were not speaking English. Spanish, she assumed. Although she did not understand that language, she knew Carlotta's father was a Spaniard, and her mother had spoken Spanish as well. A branch snapped between her feet as she approached, and the two took a guilty step apart. A guilty step? What you up to? Isabel said in a friendly manner, Evan, I did not realize you spoke Spanish. He shrugged. A little. A little Portuguese, too. I fought in the Peninsula War, after all. Came in handy. Sadly, your accent is not so good, Lottie said in teasing tones. He grinned at her. Are you offering to tutor me? Perhaps realizing they were flirting in front of Isabel, Lottie looked self-conscious, and the captain cleared his throat. Isabel said, It must have been difficult to learn amid all that fighting. Were you not primarily with your own countrymen? He nodded. Yes, until I was left for dead near Talavera. A Spanish couple found me and nursed my wounds. I was with them for some time and learned more of the language then. They saved my life. Thank God, Isabel breathed. Carlotta nodded her agreement and said, My father came from Madrid, not far from there, I don't think. Oh? Where is he now? No idea. He left Mamma when I was quite young. I have not seen him in years. How despicable. I would never do that. Never betray someone I loved. He sent a veiled glance at Isabel. Easy words to say, Captain, Carlotta said mildly. How did he end up in England? Evan asked. He was an actor. My mother's parents were also from Spain and happy to hire a fellow from their homeland. They managed a theater off Covent Garden. You performed there as well, is that right? Yes, and for several other theaters. She was quite famous, Isabel said, though she used a stage name then. Oh, what was it? Maria Carlita Vega. Ah, I have heard of you. Lottie made a face. I won't ask what you heard, for I doubt it was good. I heard that you were talented, and his eyes narrowed as if recalling something else he had heard, but he did not repeat it. And as I've listened to you sing, I know that much is true. Thank you, Captain. I hope you don't believe everything you hear. A certain type of man tends to boast about conquests to impress other men, whether true or not. Yes, I imagine you encountered quite a few of that sort in your former profession, but I am not one of them. He drew himself up. Well, I am off to London on some unfinished business, if you will excuse me. He turned away, then looked back at Carlotta. May I bring you anything from town? Anything you are missing? Her eyes sparkled. Oh, I would love some pimentos de padron. A costermonger in Covent Garden sells them. Delicious. He touched his heart and bowed, gaze locked on Carlotta's. Your wish is my command. Did he or Teddy ever look at me like that? Isabel wondered. Evan hesitated, then glanced at Isabel. And sugar plums from Fortnum and Mason for you, Belle? He remembered. How thoughtful. Thank you. Captain Curtis took his leave with a tip of his hat. Adios, ladies. They watched him go. A handsome man, Lottie mused. And charming. I imagine he looks dashing in uniform. Isabel turned and studied her friend's profile with interest. Probably. Too bad officers only wear them while on duty, and perhaps on formal occasions. Yes, a pity. Isabel gazed around the garden. She remembered hiding behind that big topiary bush with Evan, while Teddy counted and then searched for them. It was the first time Evan had held her hand. She became aware of Carlotta studying her profile. How do you feel about him now that he is back? She asked. Isabel thought. Then she looked behind her in case he might be near enough to overhear. She didn't want to hurt him any more than she already had. Isabel said solemnly, Guilty, if I am honest. You are not pining for him, not hoping to rekindle the old flame? Isabel searched her heart. She had no hopes of Evan for herself, she didn't think. So why was she struggling? Was she afraid of losing Lottie? Or was it because her friend may have found something she wanted for herself? I told you I have often thought about him over the years. I suppose I have romanticized him, built him up into more of a romantic hero than flesh and blood human. But now that he's here, I care for him, of course, as a friend. But no, I don't pine for him. I don't know if it is because of Teddy or Mr. Booker's arrival and all that may bode, or what. My money is on Mr. Booker. Carlotta grinned, then sent her another measuring look. Whatever the reason, I am relieved to hear you say so. When you told me Percy sent him away, I too conjured an image of a tragic hero. But now that I have met him, I don't see it as a tragedy or a grave injustice. Oh? Why? Because you are not suited in my view. I admire you both, but not together. Again Isabel raised her brows. Do you admire him? Well, of course I admire any man who serves his king and country. It was Isabel's turn to grin. Right. Very patriotic of you. Watching Carlotta's reaction, she asked, He seems to return your admiration, does he not? Carlotta raised an uncertain hand. Not really. I think he sees only you. I am lost in your shadow. Isabel considered, then added, or the shadows of the past. So we've got a good mix of mystery drama and angst and romance drama.